There were, of course, dissidents in Eastern Europe, in fact, but they're very different from the dissidents elsewhere in the world. They're much more concerned with themselves, they're not internationally oriented. It's very striking. I mean, let me give you an example. So just to give an illustration in relating to Czechoslovakia, I mentioned last night that immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall in El Salvador, U.S. dependency, the high command of the army sent a murderous battalion, which had a record of thousands of killings, sent them to attack the university and murder 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, which they did. A couple of days after that, Václav Havel came to the United States, spoke before a joint session of Congress, and got rousing applause when he praised the United States as the defenders of freedom. Okay. Now just imagine the situation reversed. Suppose that Russian-trained, Russian-armed forces were sent into a university in Czechoslovakia and murdered Havel and half a dozen of his associates. And imagine that a Latin American intellectual were to come to Russia, speak at the Duma, and praise the Russians as the defenders of freedom. That is absolutely inconceivable. But when it happens from an Eastern European dissident, it's not only conceivable, but it happened and it's applauded. And that's very characteristic. The Eastern European dissidents, as compared with others, tended to regard themselves as the only oppressed people in the world. In fact, the term dissident just means Eastern European. You don't even talk about the murdered Latin Americans as dissidents. And in fact, I'm sure none of you ever heard their names. Everyone knows the names of the East European dissidents. If I were to run through the names of the murdered Latin Americans, including an archbishop who was murdered while he was reading Mass, you would never have heard of them. And I think the point was that the Eastern European dissidents were uniquely privileged. They're the only dissidents in history who have ever had the massive support of the most powerful systems in the world. So they were honored, lauded, not because they were unusual. In fact, other dissidents were treated much more harshly, but because they were in an enemy state. So therefore you laud them and praise them. And they came to internalize that. They came to internalize the view that they're the only people who are oppressed, and therefore they don't share the kind of internationalism that's common to dissidents in most of the world, which is a very striking difference. You see it when you travel around the world and are in contact with dissident elements. And I had a feeling, to get back to the beginning, that the insularity of the perspective probably reflects the same thing. Some sense that Eastern Europe was uniquely oppressed, so we're only concerned with ourselves. In fact, it was oppressed, but by comparative standards, much less than in U.S. domains, much less. You didn't have hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered. You didn't have archbishops assassinated while they were reading Mass. You didn't have Latin American, you don't have intellectuals whose heads were blown off by Russian-trained terrorist forces, and on and on. I mean, the record in, say, Latin America or the Philippines, Southeast Asia is much worse than Eastern Europe in the post-Stalin era. But that conception is not comprehended.